I am joined today by my colleagues Bonnie Farco and Carlos Castrosana Fernandez. This, of course, marks our 13th visit to South Sudan since the Commission was established in 2016. As you know, the Commission is supported by a secretariat that is based in Juba, and it is an independent body that is mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council to investigate and report on human rights violations with a particular focus on conflict-related sexual violence and ethnic violence. Our role, of course, is to document the violations and to collect and preserve evidence for the purposes of future accountability. The evidence is intended to go to the transitional justice mechanisms once established, but of course also to ensure that the voices of victims are heard. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge that we have, over the last few years, received cooperation from the government of South Sudan. We're able to have our secretariat here and to move freely around, and we ourselves have been able to come in quite freely. This week, we engaged with government officials, with survivors of human rights abuses, and civil society actors. We also met with the international and regional representatives who are supporting South Sudan's transition under the 2018 Revitalized Agreement, which has now been extended by the political parties in the Government of National Unity for another 2 years. This extension is set to begin on the 22nd of February 2025. And in our meetings with South Sudanese civil society, they have voiced deep concerns over this extension, fearing that it's yet another delay tactic to push elections even further out of reach. We visited Kwajok in Warrap State, where we were confronted with the stark realities of sexual and gender-based violence. We also met with numerous young girls forced into marriage, treated as commodities, exchanged for cattle as for dowry, and these teenage survivors shared harrowing stories of being coerced into marriages with men often more than 20 years their senior, enduring rape, physical abuse, and forced pregnancies. Many victims told us that they were trapped in these unwanted relationships because their families refused for them to return home because they didn't want to return the dowry. And this left them with no means of escape and really only being able to depend on the one-stop centers which have been set up, but which are now also struggling because of the lack of international aid. Now, this suffering exists along extreme poverty and a complete lack of development, and local authorities lamented their scarce resources, while victims of brutal abuses described their total lack of access to even the most basic services. And to be frank, can't believe that so many years after independence, we are still talking about government institutions failing people. Impunity has been entrenched, and lawlessness exists almost throughout the country instead of upholding justice. In Warrap State alone, a region home to many in power who are based in Juba, there is just one judge with jurisdiction traveling across 6 counties, and justice just remains a distant, inaccessible promise. But this crisis is not isolated. It is a symptom of a broader collapse. South Sudan's violence, fueled by political actors and elite politicians, has spread beyond traditional hotspots, such as Western Equatoria and Unity States, fragmenting the nation. Just this month, we've seen direct clashes reported between the SSPDF and the SPLMA-IO in Western Bahr Ghazal, and the potential for further violence in the Upper Nile is alarming, while civilians in parts of northern Bahr Ghazal and Jonglei states are living amidst heavy security deployments and further violence. And these, troubling patterns persist across the country. It's entrenched impunity, given that there's no accountability for human rights violations and absolutely no effective response. There's also a complete absence of governance and basic services, particularly in the justice and healthcare and education sectors. And of course, what you're seeing is really the outcome of years of corruption and predation by political elites. This situation is, of course, further compounded by severe international aid cuts, with humanitarian support diminishing and South Sudan's vast oil revenues diverted away from the people. The suffering deepens, and even if oil production resumes, there is little hope that citizens will reap any of the benefits. Since 2017, our reports have highlighted these fault lines, emphasizing the government's failure to implement key provisions of the revitalized agreement. I feel like a stuck record. Every time I come, I speak of the failure around the unification of the armed forces, the need for the finalization of a permanent constitution, and really dealing with the questions of the economic crimes and corruption. Time and time again in our meetings with government and political leadership, we have urged them to prioritize human rights and to address the urgent needs of their people, and to take meaningful steps to protect the more than 2 million refugees and 2 million internally displaced persons. And yet, as we enter another 2-year extension, we see no political will, no commitment to dealing with these outstanding provisions. The unification question, which I think is huge in terms of security, the passing of a permanent constitution, and the long overdue elections, and no sense of urgency from leaders who remain detached from the suffering of their own citizens. And to be honest, without genuine political will and financial commitment, this latest extension will lead to more of the same failures. The one positive note, of course, is the passing of legislation to establish the Commission on Truth, Healing and Reconciliation and the Reparations and Compensation Authority. However, the third complementary mechanism, the hybrid court, there is no talk of when that will be established. And in fact, it remains the subject of a ping-pong battle between the government and the African Union, with each side claiming that they are waiting for the other to take action. But having, of course, passed the legislation, we need to understand that a commission will only be regarded as credible and legitimate if from the outset it is linked to a transparent, credible process of choosing commissioners. It shouldn't be the subject of backroom deals where you appoint people who are politically connected. This is an opportunity, like the national dialogue was, for South Sudanese to have a voice in the stakes of what should be their country be about and how to build nationhood and national reconciliation. But to do so, you need the space, you need security. And the NSS amendments, the Articles 54 and 55, should be repealed because people cannot speak freely if they continue to live in fear. So tangible accountability and action are imperative going forward. We visited, one of the one-stop centers in Kwajok this week. And I was struck by the fact that the caseworkers' salaries had not been paid for the last few months. And in fact, there was only one medical doctor, one forensic data person, and one legal officer, whereas they are intended to work in pairs, and none of them had received salaries. Now, the one-stop centers are mainly funded by UNFPA, and already as of, I think, the 25th of January, UNFPA had indicated that because of these executive orders in the United States and, of course, the complete sort of shutdown of USAID ID, that funding was going to cease. And so we raised this with the Ministry of Gender, because you will recall that the caseworkers are supposed to be paid by the Ministry of Gender, and it's really the other specialists that are paid by UNFPA. And the ministry was very honest. They have no money. They get less than 1% of the total budget. And I think, as one of the officials said, when you look at the way in which budgeting is done in South Sudan, security sits right at the top of the pile. But in terms of dealing with what we would say development programs and social services, that's not prioritized. And that's reflected in the way in which budgets have been allocated. We also held a meeting with a number of civil society organizations, with the religious community, the media, oversight groups, and the situation is dire. Many of them spoke about even the difficulties of finding money to travel to meetings, just paying for petrol. And where people used to perhaps eat 2 meals a day, if they get 1 meal a day, that is a lot. So I think besides the economic situation in South Sudan itself, which Carlos spoke to, I think that South Sudan is quite a vibrant civil society, but there is no doubt that the funding cuts are going to have a huge impact on their ability to function, and that humanitarian actors in the country are also going to struggle with providing the kind of services they do. And, when you look at our reports, we've always made the point that, in fact, it's the humanitarians who take care of what ordinary citizens need. The government has just sort of contracted that out to them. And I think now you are going to see the impact of this in South Sudan felt really acutely. Let me go to the question of the list of perpetrators. And, that list has increased. We now have 150 persons of interest, in terms of which we have prepared dossiers. And those dossiers are intended, in fact, to be handed over to the prosecutor of a future hybrid court. And what we are currently also considering is, once the Commission on Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation gets set up, and the Compensation and Reparations Authority, how we can ensure that we hand over information which will allow them to also be able to do their work, but obviously not compromising the questions of future criminal accountability. So yes, they are there. I think sometimes in our reports we have been fairly radical in disclosing the names of perpetrators, and that is an option we consider. How the information we have can also be used strategically to initiate some kind of accountability. I think it's quite shocking that despite, I would say, good laws and policies, and I would say political will or a commitment by the Ministry of Gender, unfortunately, we also see that sexual and gender-based violence are on the increase. And obviously, given, the kind of conflicts which are taking place, I mean, at a subnational level, and of course, I think when you look at the new areas where fighting has broken out between political factions, it seems that the first targets are women and children. And, when we were up in Kwajok the other day, a 7-year-old girl who had been raped by a soldier, I think we saw 4 young girls who had been forcibly married off at 13, and they'd been married off to old men. But because their families themselves were so desperate to escape poverty, the offer of cattle as dowry was quite alluring. And people then just accept that. It's quite frightening, because even when they ran away and they tried to go back because of the kind of abuse they suffered, parents send them back because nobody wants to give the cattle back. And so you're locked in this situation of, I think all of them said, we wanted to go to school and we wanted to be able to learn to read and write. And here you have, I think the numbers are extraordinary, and the Commission basically looks at these emblematic cases. But how can a country, prosper when half of its population is kind of subjected to such dire conditions? So I think that's the one thing that we picked up. The other is, of course, the executions. While initially, because of the lawlessness in the country, I think people didn't see that the Green Book could be used in such an arbitrary way to target people, and that's quite striking. And Carlos and Barney could probably talk more to that. I think I'm going to leave the question of the leadership question, because we also went to observe some of the Tumeni process, and of course to meet some of the people who are part of the holdout groups, and Barney can deal with that. But one of the things we focused on a lot is the fact that civic space has been eroded. And I think you will recall that the Commission wrote to the President saying, please don't sign this legislation, because it had come up in the discussions with quite a number of ministers that national security services shouldn't in fact have the kind of powers, the usurping powers that belong to the police. And when they're used in a punitive fashion, then obviously what you get is abuse. And this is certainly an issue. I mean, I think there were a number of journalists who were here and who were part of oversight bodies, and in fact they're still trying to find out what has happened to certain people who have been disappeared, basically. And so the harassment continues. It's even worse for women. And, as one person from the media said, these guys come into our centers. They want to see what we're publishing, and if they don't like it, then you are ordered not to publish. People talk about not being able to have workshops because you still need that signature. And so even though the person at the top may have changed, the situation hasn't changed. And that is why in our report we also urge that those offending articles should be removed. But it's also about a culture that has become endemic in South Sudan. And, I was struck by the fact that there's a real fear about speaking out, because you just don't know what's going to happen to you. Now, how can you have such important processes like consultations on constitution making or consultations on what the Truth Commission should look like? How are people going to come forward when what they need is really the guarantee that they can do so freely? And it's a very different time to when the national dialogue process took place in South Sudan. People felt more comfortable with speaking out then than they do now. And they weren't frightened to actually convey to the president what people were saying in the most remote parts of the country and even in the refugee camps. So yeah, it's a problem.